I'm so happy to be here, amongst the enemy. Uh, just kidding. Um, I think it's awesome that you have a natural history society group, that it's unique. They don't exist everywhere. And I think it's very, very cool that you all come together and celebrate the natural world. And I'm very happy to be here and share with you some of the things that I've learned over the years of studying birds. Tom already mentioned that the name of my lab is the Little Bird Lab. Perhaps you remember a few years ago, a Shark Talk that was given by my husband, who named his lab the Big Fish Lab. So that happened first. Then, of course, kind of tongue in cheek, I was like, okay, well, fine. I'm the Little Bird Lab. So we are, even though now we have flamingos. Yeah, that was Taylor Chapel. So anyway, we're the Little Bird Lab, and even though we study one of the biggest birds in pink flamingos, but that's kind of new. So it's not that wasn't the case when I named it that. Well, what I want to talk to you about today is how birds cope with change in their environments. And environments change in a lot of different ways. So we are all familiar with some of these types of changes where you have diel cycles that happen, colder in the morning, warmer during the day. This, especially if you're a small invertebrate living in the soil, is a huge change every single day to your life. There's slightly longer cycles like tidal cycles again, invertebrates living in these habitats experience these huge changes. I don't think I can get that to stop showing up, so we might just have to deal with it. And then there are even longer term changes like seasonal changes. This is one of the study sites that I'll talk about today in Grand Teton National Park. In Wyoming, I have a very long-term study going on there. And this is a place that experiences really extreme seasonality, where the risks and the benefits of being in this habitat change hugely across the year. And animals need to cope with that. And there are lots of different strategies for coping with that. In the ecophysiology world, we call it MAD. You can move, adapt, or die. Obviously, that last one maybe not ideal, right? This is what we're trying to avoid. And yeah, I put up some pictures of mad birds. But to be fair, I included another taxa that's almost an animal. Hang on, where is he? Oh boy, this is there. Oh no, there he is. It's not always just birds that look mad. But in any case, animals can have different strategies. They can, if you're going to be a mover, if you're a mobile species, then you could migrate in and out of these conditions to take advantage of the resource pulse, but then get out of Dodge when things get really hard and avoid the hard times. Other strategies, you stay and maybe you hibernate, or maybe you use torpor, or maybe you switch food items. Whatever it is, you have some type of adaptive response that allows you to change your behavior, your physiology, and cope with the conditions that are there. I'm not sure why I'm having to click on the screen, but that's okay. So what we see is that a lot of animals evolve these annual schedules, and they partition stages of their lives to match the most appropriate environmental conditions for whatever they're trying to do. So in a mobile species like birds, that might involve a migration, typically north in the spring to take advantage of that huge pulse of resources that happens. They'll breed on that resource pulse, maybe replace all their feathers during a feather molt, and then migrate away before conditions get really challenging. And the advantage of this, or the ability for animals to do this type of strategy, has evolved because those changes are highly predictable. So they can be at a really remote location, say South America, and use changes in day length to know when it's time to come back north and take advantage of the resource pulse. So because it's predictable, right? So they can use long distance cues to know when to go. But a lot of change in environments is not predictable. And I've gotten more and more interested in those types of challenges in animals because I think they are critically important selective events. A lot of animals don't make it through some of these challenges, and I'm interested in learning about what helps animals to make it, and in what kind of conditions do they not. And so this is just some examples of extreme cold, rainstorm, sleet, assuming the posture there into the wind, and wildfire, right? These are two pretty unpredictable events for animals. And food can be difficult to acquire during these events. So perhaps you remember we have a couple of recent big ice storms that have brought down tons of trees. And when these happen, they cover, the entire surface that's exposed. So maybe there's some tree wells where, birds could forage and try to find food and get through the event. But this is a really hard event. I can guarantee you there's a lot of mortality during those big ice storms, especially for really small animals that don't have a lot of time when they can't eat, right? If you're trying to maintain body temperature, you're a little endotherm, you have to eat every day, or you're not gonna go long without eating. And food can be hard to find. And that can happen also with things like heat domes and whatnot, when insects change their behaviors and birds now have a hard time finding food. So it can happen in a lot of different direct or indirect ways. And what we know from kind of, again, an ecophysiology perspective is that extinction risk, you can think about this on an individual level, just death, or you can think about a population level, a local population, and go out from there. But the risk of dying during one of these events is related to the duration of the challenge and the magnitude of the challenge. And both of those things matter, as well as how far apart they are. Because a lot of animals can survive a short extreme event. But if you couple that with a second event right after it, now your chances go down because there's no chance to recover, restore the food supply and the fat in your body, or whatever you need to do, repair heat damage, whatever it is, there needs to be time in order to heal and to survive the next event. And what we see is as the baseline changes for things like temperature, or storm intensity and frequency, is that there's more frequent extinction chances, right? Where we're just pushing animals into harder conditions for longer and more frequently. And we know that there are these big events that can cause really high mortality. The upper one was a big storm in Europe that killed estimates of many tens of thousands of seabirds. And then the bottom one is from the 2020, I don't know if you remember, but during the big fire years when the wind inverted and it was all on us in 2020, and the sky was, was full of really thick smoke. A lot of migrant birds ended up, we think, getting pushed out early and needed to leave. And they weren't ready. So migrants have to make preparations in order to make these long distance flights. So they ended up getting pushed south earlier than they normally would have been. And then there was an unseasonably cold snap that happened in the American Southwest that killed hundreds of thousands of mostly warblers. And this was really noticeable. People were finding dead birds just like on their, in their yard. And so it made the news because so many people were noticing. And then subsequent kind of tests and models suggest it was a combination of this early migration from the fires combined with a cold snap. So what I'm interested in and what our lab investigates are the energy costs of these type of events for songbirds. And then what are the various adaptations that they have in order to try to survive some of these challenges? And finally, individuals make different decisions during these events. So how do those decisions, first of all, what makes them make those decisions, and then how do those decisions lead to different fitness kind of outcomes? I saved my nest, I didn't save my nest. Or I saved myself, I didn't save myself. Those kinds of outcomes. But the problem with studying unpredictability is that it's not predictable. So it's really hard to study these things in the field. You really have to be in the right place at the right time, it's very challenging. And we can chase smoke events and chase storms and whatnot. But to really be effective, that's really hard. And so what we do is we use a combination of field studies, but also captive studies in order to ask, very kind of specific and pointed questions. And these are the different contexts that Tom was mentioning in my website and the different projects. There's more now because of the flamingos, but these are kind of some of the main contexts in which we have projects that we're interested in. And I'm going to start by telling you a story about food shortages and how birds might cope with those. And for this, I use my favorite species, the red crossbill, which has this unique morphology in its bill that is adapted to prying apart the scales of conifer cones so they can get the seeds out with their tongue. So it's kind of a lateral movement. I'll show you here. So this is actually a male in captivity. They lose their red. They can become a little duller. But you can see him kind of pry open the scale there and then stick his tongue down in and get the seed out. And so they're really efficient at this. They're the only species that can utilize conifer seeds in the summer when the cones are immature and green and closed. They can pry them apart and get the seeds out. They're not as nutritious at that time of year, but they can do it. And so they can utilize the food source quicker than any other bird species. Once the cones mature and look more like the one in this picture and they open a little more, and then through the winter, lots of different species of bird utilize these conifer seed crops, which are lipid dense. They're very rich in energy. And so they're great food sources, but there are also problems associated with being so specialized on something. They do eat insects and whatnot in the spring if they come across them, but they are highly specialized on conifer seeds, as the bill suggests. The problem with that is conifers, as a defense against seed predators, and especially squirrels, they produce a big massed crop of seeds one year and then won't for several years. And that kills off the squirrels. People always are a little horrified by that. Trees murdering squirrels. But obviously this is an arms race, and they're trying to spread their seeds. And so they've evolved this strategy of producing huge bumper crops of seeds, but not every year. And so being a mobile bird, crossbills can move and try to find those seed crops. So they're nomadic. And once a year in the spring, when the seed crops are first developing, that's temporally consistent, they make a seasonal migration to go try to find a seed crop. We don't know how they find them. It's not probably random. It feels that way to us, but they show up in huge numbers in these places with new seed crops. It's one of the mysteries that we still are trying to figure out. But if they can find a seed crop, then they can settle on that seed crop and hopefully stay for a whole year. But that depends on the weather and whether or not all the seeds fall out of the cones early or late. And so if that happens and the seed crops crash because of dispersal, then the birds might need to make an eruptive migration in order to escape that big decline in food. And this is kind of basically an emergency type of situation where, this is a tiny bird in a vast landscape. And they're going to maybe need to, as the seeds disperse out of the cones, they're going to maybe need to leave, right? And go find better conditions somewhere else. And I just include this picture to think about the scope and the scale of the problem. And to imagine being this teeny tiny bird with a really high metabolic rate, you've got to eat a lot of food. And now you're gonna have to exercise a lot and try to fly a really long distance to find something that you're not even sure if you're going in the right direction, if you're gonna find something better or worse. It's kind of a terrifying problem. And these eruptive migrations aren't unique to crossbills. They happen across a lot of species, especially in the boreal north, where you have a lot of species that are dependent on these seed crops. And there can be large-scale failures where all of these species invade the south. And that's very exciting to birders. These are like the big finch years, is when food fails in the north and they come south. And they can end up in really wacky places. And of course, any species that could move could do this, not just the ones that are adapted to conifer seeds, but lots of, anything that can move will probably do it if they're desperate, right, and starving. And I always like to point out that that includes us, right? Humans are eruptive migrants as well. If things get bad enough, people will move. And I think it's always important to remember that people who are making these movements, they're oftentimes in a way villainized, by our culture, or by the, particular news outlets or groups. But these are really, truly desperate people. They're escaping something that's awful in the hopes of finding something better. And many of them die on the way. They don't actually make it, in a lot of cases. So these eruptive migrations are really risky. The timing is unpredictable, so they might not have a lot of time to prepare if the food supply is crashing. They may have to survive on not conifer seeds, right? On atypical food items that they can just find and try to keep going on their journey. And they may be traveling through kind of unknown, inhospitable habitats. They don't know the predator landscape if you leave your home. There's a lot of challenges to overcome. So I became interested in how do they decide to make that decision? That's a big decision. And when do you leave your home for the unknown, out there? And so I started becoming interested in the physiological mechanisms and the stress response. So we talk about stress a lot. We say we're stressed out kind of a lot of time. And so as a biologist, it's important to define what you mean when you talk about stress. And in the context of food and this problem, we're going to define stress as when the energy requirements exceed the energy intake. So you're basically in a negative energy balance, and you can't stay that way for long if you're a small-bodied animal, even if you're us, right? There's a limit for how long we can't eat and still be okay. So when that happens, the brain detects this imbalance in caloric expense versus intake, and initiates a hormone cascade that's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And the end result of that cascade is a hormone that will coordinate a whole body response to the challenge. And so in humans, that's cortisol. In birds, the main one is corticosterone. We both have both, but the dominant one is different in different species. And what this hormone does is it coordinates, again, this response. So energy storing cells like adipocytes or the liver might start to break down energy substrates and make sure that the blood is packed full of nutrients for action, right? For whatever the bird's going to need to do, the cells need to be well supplied with glucose and amino acids and whatever other energy substrates they might need. It will typically inhibit reproduction, especially if it stays high for a long time. And so it'll basically, the way we think about it is it shifts behavior and physiology away from a short-term investment like reproduction towards a long-term investment like survival. So they might start searching for more food. They might abandon a nest. They might even leave the area entirely, and that would be the eruptive migration part. So I was interested in this in the context of food. And so this was back as a graduate student at UC Davis. I took crossbills into the lab, and then I basically studied how do their stress hormones change when we restrict how much food they're eating. So we did a food restriction, and the well-fed birds had pretty low, nearly undetectable corticosterone levels. But when you food restrict birds, indeed, they mount a stress response. This is not, if this didn't happen, I would have been very shocked. So that was great. But I was at the same time really interested by the fact that you don't see one crossbill flying somewhere, right? Very rarely. They move like this in big flocks. I don't think that whole flock is necessarily socially stable, but they're social. They're very highly social animals. And I thought for sure they are making decisions together. So how does that work? If it's a physiological response to food declining, how do they coordinate? How do they talk to each other? And how do they make this decision as a group? And so in this experiment, when I paired them, or when I did this food restriction, I gave them a neighbor that was either a bird that was well fed or a bird that was also food restricted. So we have kind of social information from a neighbor that either disagrees with their assessment of the food supply and the habitat or agrees, right? So it's either the same or it's different. And then when we looked at the stress response, we saw that a bird that was food restricted, so it had the same physiological challenge, doesn't mount as much of a stress response if its neighbor thinks things are okay. Whereas the ones that had the well-fed, or sorry, the food restricted neighbor, then there was a stronger stress response. So the social cues influenced their physiological response to the stressor. So that was cool. That was my career making discovery. And it was a bit of a whim too when I was pairing the birds. Yeah.
This is nanograms of quart per milliliter of blood because you're taking blood.
Yes, correct. Yeah, yeah. Per plasma. Yeah. Yeah. So we repeated this experiment because we were really interested in how, like, what's driving this effect, not so much in the behavior level, but in the brain. And so I collaborated with a woman, Simone Metal at University of Edinburgh in Scotland, who was the only person that had the primers for these mRNA for the QRT receptors in the brain. So this is obviously, we're looking at the brain. So this was a terminal experiment. I don't do very many of those, but there's every once in a while, I decide that it's scientifically worthwhile enough to do it. And I always, of course, try to minimize how many birds I'm using because I don't like that either. And I think it's a really interesting discovery that it didn't matter for the receptor expression in the brain. So we were looking at brain regions that control stress responses. So, how strongly do you react to a stressor and how quickly do you turn off the stress response? Those are two things that are really important in regulating stress in animals, including in us. We have the same exact process in our bodies. And this influences a lot how birds respond to stress. So I wanted to know if food restriction changed that or if the social cues did. And we were completely shocked that the food restriction did not. So there was no change, no difference in receptor expression for the birds that actually were food restricted versus well-fed. But what mattered a ton was the neighbor. So this is a 50% change in mineralocorticoid receptor, MR, expression. This is one of the receptors for the stress hormone, showed this huge reduction if there was this social information from a distressed neighbor. And this is a brain region in the hippocampus that controls how sensitive the HPA axis is to stress. So it could explain why there was more or less QRT release depending on the neighboring bird. So after that, I said, okay, well, what's the functional purpose of this? Like, why should you let other birds influence how you react to the environment? Maybe they're wrong. Why not just use your own information? So I formed a hypothesis that social information from other individuals in the flock could be an early warning system to you that things are getting hard. So if there's maybe juveniles in the flock that aren't as good at foraging, or just the variety of birds out there, they're better and worse at getting seeds. So there would be alarms that might be sounding in the flock if things are declining. And maybe that should influence your kind of overall assessment of the environment. So by the way, these are long-tailed tits from my time in Russia that are also eruptive nomads, also very social, and they're also the cutest birds. They're like cotton ball size. They're very tiny, and then they're just like this white puff with like black eyes and a tiny black bill. They're very, very cute, and they have long tails, so they're the long-tailed tit. And they call them in Russian, they call them soup spoons because they look like a soup spoon. Okay, so anyway, so do these cues maybe prepare birds? So for that, in the prior experiments, I'd always just given the food restriction at the same time. So two birds were food restricted, or two birds weren't, or you had the mixed. So now what I did is in those mixed pairs, I then food restricted the bird who had kind of listened to the neighbor. So I gave them a preparative type of information. And then, so I food restrict one, and then I food restrict the other and ask, does this one that got restricted later do better? If it's a warning signal, they should do better with kind of coping with this restriction. And that's what we found. So if you take those crossbill neighbors and you give one set of birds that both the neighbor gets food restricted at the same time, that's the gray ones. That's like the experiment I did before. And you can see that after 1 day of restriction, they lose about 1 gram of mass. And after 2, they lose 2 grams of mass. But if you give that warning, if you restrict the neighbor first, and then you restrict the focal bird, they lose less mass. They had almost 50% mass savings. So they did better after being warned by their neighbor that things were getting worse. So that was really interesting. But I was curious if this is just a weird crossbill thing because they're this highly adapted species to conifer seeds and this really challenging food supply. So we looked at 2 other species of cardueline finch, including, so the pine siskin, which is also a nomadic eruptive species. So we kind of expected that they would have this adaptation as well. We weren't sure if house finches would. They're in the West, they are non-migratory. We got these from Davis, actually, from California, where they live there year-round. It's a very stable environment, and they don't go anywhere. So if anybody was gonna maybe just ignore neighbors and just assess the environment on their own, I thought it would be them. But they actually showed almost the strongest protective effect. So we were surprised by that. But it's interesting that this seems to be a broad scale trait across birds with different life history strategies and migratory strategies. But as I mentioned before, social information can be wrong, and it's wrong a lot. And we've seen this in our world as well. In this time of social media, it's a huge problem. It's a huge risk that you don't necessarily know if you can trust social information that's coming at you from all these different angles and sources. And we saw it during the pandemic in the poison control center and in hospitalizations for drugs that were being promoted via social media, but without the care and advice of doctors. And so people were doing stupid things, basically. They were taking things based on advice of friends and not medical experts, and landing themselves in the hospital in the process. But they trusted their information. So we made use of the crossbill system again, because crossbills are a suite of different ecotypes, we call them. They're different morphs. They're maybe different species. This is debated up and down and sideways by ornithologists, whether or not you're a lumper or a splitter of crossbills. I don't care that much. I mostly just care what the birds think. And I'll show you one thing they think in a minute. But what this graph is showing you is the bill characteristics. So we have bill depth on the x-axis and groove width on the whatever the z. And then the y is fitness. So what it's showing is that there are different adaptive peaks of having a bill of a different size. And that bill is best, performs best on cones of different sizes. So this type 3 is it's actually the smallest billed crossbill. They feed on western hemlock, but they also can feed on spruces and Douglas fir and even ponderosa pine. So they have a lot of options, but in these experiments, Craig Mankman documented that they do have different performances on different conifer species. So, and then the biggest billed bird is type 2 in my studies anyway. And they're best adapted to ponderosa pine. So pretty different conifers there, including different distributions geographically. Where you find hemlocks and spruces is not typically where you find ponderosa pine. But there's a lot of geographical overlap. It's very messy. But I was curious if I am interested in this, the social information, all of these crossbills, even though they're different and they have different vocalizations, by the way, that's actually how we formally assign them a type, is their call structure. They like each other. So I can catch type 2 crossbills with type 3 decoy and vice versa. So they're very responsive. We already knew that. They hang out in mixed type flocks all the time, but they usually assortatively mate. They mate with their own call type most of the time. There's like a couple of cases of mixed type pairings. So I wanted to know, do type 2 crossbills value information from other types? And these are the types I tested. Type 3, which has a very different foraging performance, and therefore their information should be less accurate than, say, type 5, which has a very close morphology, very close. Their peaks are here and here in adaptive space. So they have very similar bills. We find them in the same places, foraging and breeding on the same tree species. So we made a prediction that type 2 crossbills should respond more to type 5 than to type 3. And then we also included pine siskins as a more distant, relative, but also feeds heavily on conifer seeds. So and they hang out in mixed flocks together all the time too. So it's still a relevant species, but even further away in terms of ecological relevance to their own foraging performance. So this was actually an undergraduate project that I helped to mentor. We, because of capture challenges with type 5s in Wyoming, we ended up having to do one set of experiments in the winter and another in the summer. I did not think this would matter. Ha. It does. They are much better at food restrictions and coping with food restrictions in the winter than they are in the summer. You think about it now, and I'm like, well, yeah, that makes sense. The risk is so much higher in the winter than it is in the summer that presumably they have different strategies for coping with a decline in food. So here it is right here. So these are both type 2s that didn't have any kind of social warning. So this is what we're comparing everybody else to. And you can see that they lost way more mass in the summer. That bar is much deeper than in the winter. I guess I should have said to you, these are time restricted feedings. So the way we restrict them is we just give them 2 opportunities a day to eat for a short period of time. And so they actually can improve. They can get better. They can eat more during that time, and they kind of learn to do that. But so it's not like an absolute caloric restriction. They do have some flexibility there. And that was kind of important. I wanted them to be able to improve their performance when they'd had warning. So that's why we did it that way. Okay, so what happened? Okay, with their own type 2 neighbor, so same type information, both seasons, they showed about that 50% savings. So social information is working in both seasons. Great. That would have been a problem if it didn't, because then our experiment would have not worked. But what we found is that they didn't pay attention to social information from either of the other crossbill ecotypes. So at least in this experiment, crossbills are being quite selective in the information that they're getting from this neighbor, and it has to be the same ecotype. It can't be a closely related conspecific, even one that forages on almost the exact same food and in mixed types all the time. So they're really careful about this. So to summarize that section, we're finding that social cues are priming the brain to respond more strongly to stressors in the environment, food stress in this case. These social cues can protect the ability to assimilate nutrients. I didn't show you a graph or talk about this for time's sake, but what we found is that one of the mechanisms that they're saving that mass by is by preserving their intestinal size. So they're keeping bigger intestines that can get more nutrients out of the same amount of food. So they ate the identical amount of food. This is why I looked at the intestines, because like, how did that work? They ate the same amount of food, but one of them lost twice as much mass. And so I thought it has to be the gut, that they're better at getting food out of their nutrients out of their food in one case than the other, because behavior was also the same. And that turned out to be true. So they had longer, bigger intestines when they had social warning. So it's changing the brain, it's changing the gut. It's amazing. And all of this is allowing for better outcomes. So they're conserving their mass. They also better maintain their flight muscles during these restrictions. And that's really important for a bird that might need to move away. It might need to migrate away. So if you allow your muscle to deteriorate in favor of other organs, it might affect your mobility. And in fact, house finches are not good at that, and they're the resident. So, sorry. So lots of interesting connections that we're finding there. Okay, it's brain break time. That means music. So I do this in my class lectures too, on campus, because I have very long lectures, an hour and a half, which is a lot. I don't know why that. Oh, it's just the dark side of it. So I thought I would share a song with you that I wrote. Tom mentioned I just released an album, which feels very weird to say. These are just songs that I've written over like 20 years. I started learning how to play the guitar in graduate school, so I feel like that, it's fairly late in life, right? I was an adult. And my twin sister said, "Hey, we can sing." And I was like, what? In grad school. And then my husband knew how to play the guitar, so he taught me a few chords. And I spent enough time alone in the woods during my dissertation that I could learn without feeling self-conscious, which was important for me. And then I turned out that I really enjoyed, I love playing music, and I really enjoy writing songs. And some of my songs are silly, some of them are sad. But I'm going to play you a song that I wrote about my field work with crossbills. I call it Field Biology Blues because it was my second to last trip in a 7-year PhD process. So I was tired of it. I was ready to be done, even though as soon as I go home, I want to be right back out there. Probably you've experienced this too. Things to know about this song is that, and Batman was my dog, not the cartoon character. And then June was my decoy that I had for 7 years. So this is a live bird, lived with me in the lab and went on all my trips because we used their sociality to catch them, to like attract them down. So June, and I named her June. I caught her as a baby. And I named her June because June Carter Cash had just died. And so I thought that's a good name for a decoy who should attract wild birds down. So, okay, here we go. Well, they're small and red and their beaks are bent. They wander around the country 'cause their homes are spent. And all I can do is follow them. Try and remember how it was back then when I had a home. Well, it cost me a partner in a pickup truck. Spent weeks in the rain down on my luck. Lord knows why I kept following them. I got even worse when my dog joined in. I no longer was alone. I tell you, I wanna go home. Live a normal life again. It's been fun, but it's time to end. Been around the earth and back again. I wanna go home. Well, I know the coast like the back of my hand. Surfed the sea and lived on the land. Sang at night to Batman and June. Made a few friends on the road too. Somehow it's not enough. But the love of my class waiting patiently. Let's catch the last birds for my PhD. I'm heading down south to be with him. Try and live in one place again and make ourselves at home. That I tell you, wanna go home. Live a normal life again. It's been fun, but it's tapped in. Been around the earth and back again. Love crossbirds, but they're shitty friends, and I wanna go home. All right. There's my field biology blues. My brain feels better. Maybe yours does too. Okay, so how are we doing here? How are we doing on time? Do we?
We are wide open. Yeah, let's go.
Do obviously exit if when needed. I will tell you a quick story about storms. And then I'm happy to play another song if anybody wants that. And if not, we'll do some questions. Or do you want to do questions?
Jamie, let's shoot for like a quarter after.
Okay. We'll just go until we'll go until it's time to stop, then we'll stop. Okay, so animals lose heat to cold environments in lots of different ways. And so the challenge of being an endotherm in the winter is that our bodies are designed to work optimally at a particular temperature. And if our body temperature deviates from that, either hot or cold, we lose performance and we might even start to suffer problems, right? Shutdown of protein function. So we have to be able to maintain our body temperature within a range of appropriate ones. And that costs energy when it's really cold and you're constantly losing heat to the environment. So there are some ways to kind of save energy. You can use what's called torpor at night. Maybe you've seen pictures of hummingbirds that look frozen to perches and they're hanging upside down. They're in torpor and they're preserving energy by allowing their body temperature to decline, but they've lost all ability to perform, right? They can't actually do anything besides keep their cells alive when they're in that state. So they're very prone to predation or whatnot. If something finds them, it could eat them because they can't fly away. They might not even detect that something's nearby because they're shutting down in order to save energy. But most species don't go to that extreme, right? They just use a lot of energy in order to defend their body temperature. And you have to eat a lot. And if you aren't successful, then you might become hypothermic. So these are the challenges, and what many birds that stay in cold places and live there through the winter use a strategy of fattening during the day. So they'll overeat and lay down fat all day long. So in the morning, you look at this is you can actually see through bird skin. It's clear. So this is muscle that you're looking at here. It's very purple. That's the breast of the bird. It's the big, powerful flight muscle. That has very little fat associated with it, or in this cavity where they store fat. They're in the abdominal cavity. But by nighttime, they might look like this, where they have stored a whole bunch of fat by eating all day long. And then they'll burn it overnight. And then they'll look like that in the morning again, lean. Imagine if we could do that. That'd be nice. But the point is, they're living on an edge, right? So if they don't fatten for one day, now they have to burn muscle, and you're in trouble if you're burning your muscle. So this is a big challenge for birds. So there's lots of possible kind of strategies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about thermogenic capacity. This is the ability to mount a defense, and maintain your body temperature through things like shivering. So birds can minimize heat loss. They're wearing a puffy coat, and they can change the size of the puffy coat by erecting their feathers. Every feather has a little muscle at its base. And so that bird on the right is in a colder place than the bird on the left. It's almost a perfect circle. But feathers are also birds' raincoats. And the problem is that in a heavy rain, they have to do what's called slicking, where they hold the feathers tight to their body to shed water. Because if their down gets wet, they're done, right? That's a big, big problem. So they'll trade off losing body heat by losing your insulative barrier to slick and get the water away. So we think this is a challenge. This is a challenge, right? They're going to get cold. And one trend that we're seeing is, of course, warming of the baseline and warming winters. So the number of days below freezing, you can see the dark colors in the upper left. Right now, there are quite a few days below freezing in a lot of regions of our country, but by 2080, that's many fewer. We also know that this is kind of mirrored by a big change in how much snowfall is going to happen in the US because of this change in temperature, where we're getting a lot less snow. If you look at where we are, 50% or more loss. And in fact, some very alarming models suggest no snow in the Cascades in 30 years. And we're beating those models thus far. This is a model showing precipitation change. So this is a projected change out into the future. And what I just want you to see is that in the winter, we're going to have more precipitation. This is the percent change. So anything above the line, the dashed line, is an increase. And we're going to have drier summers. We're already kind of seeing that. So we're going to get wetter winters that are warmer. And what that means is more cold rain and less cold snow. So I've been very interested in what the effects of rain are on birds. So I'm not going to read this, but we're basically interested in the metabolic costs and the behavior strategies of rain on birds. And so this is kind of a long-term study now. I've been doing this for almost 15 years, building a database of free-living data from crossbills that are wearing these specialized transmitters that can measure heart rate. So you can slide these, there's teeny tiny electrodes, if you can see these, coming off of the radio. And you can slide those under the skin, which is neither vascularized nor innervated. So it's very easy to put things under bird skin. Their protective layer is their feathers, not their skin like us. And then we can follow the bird for 48 hours. We actually glue it onto their skin with fake eyelash glue. So it comes off after about a week, which is fine because the battery only lasts for about that long. And the way the radio works is if we record the signal, we can filter it later and you get these nice heart rate profiles. So we can then have an estimate of energy costs of a free living behaving bird, and it's real time, right? So there's other ways to estimate energy costs, but they're usually kind of an average across a day or even longer. And we can get like minute to minute, second to second costs of doing things. So it's very cool. We've been doing this in Grand Teton, really different challenges in summer and winter. This is Taylor, dedicated field biologist, swimming our gear across the Snake River, despite the fact that I was like, that bird's coming back. And it did. So he got all the way across and disappeared. And then I saw him running back. I was like, okay. But this is the same crossing in the winter. So we can just walk right across in the winter, at least some places of the Snake, not all of them. So what we're interested in heart rate are all the different things that can cause energy costs in birds. Your just basic keeping your cells alive. That's basal metabolic rate, BMR. That's a cost. It's actually a pretty big cost. Sickness or diseases. So we can look at blood smears and see if the bird is mounting a white blood cell response to something, or if it has blood parasites. Reproductive condition. This is a picture of a female's brood patch. So they lose their feathers off of their breast, put a bunch of liquid in there, and keep the eggs warm. It's like a little warm waterbed for eggs to incubate. We can measure nest building. This is a crossbill building a nest. She's carrying a little stick up there to put in her nest. Thermoregulation, so we have weather stations that monitor the conditions, and then activity. This is a big component of the energy cost of a bird. The muscle costs of moving and doing things and foraging all day long and flying. And we measure that by behavioral observations, watching, getting foraging intake rates. We wear GPS units as we track, so we can track kind of their home range as we follow the bird for a couple days. And then activity budgets, so we can get that from the antenna also. The antenna wobbles every time the bird flies or moves, and we can actually characterize it and know kind of what they're doing. So it's a really cool technology, but it's hard work, as you can imagine. So I'm just going to show you very quickly what happened when we looked at all of our data from 38 birds, 20 in the winter, 18 in the summer. We saw a really interesting pattern where on warm days in the summer, costs are quite low. And as you might expect, as it got colder, costs went up. But then it does a really interesting thing right around freezing where it peaks just above freezing. And then it actually starts to get cheaper as it gets even colder. And I think that this is rain because here's some anecdotes. So this is one bird. Here's the dark patches are nighttime and the white patches are daytime. And the blue line is the average heart rate. And you can see that on day one, there was a lovely blizzard that dropped about a half a foot of snow or so. It was -5. And then the next day, it warmed up just enough to be truly miserable. It was 1 degree Celsius. It was raining really hard. It was very windy too. So all these things were bad, right? It was kind of a worst case scenario. I kept some of my notes there of like, it's miserable. And it was. I remember being, kind of tucking into my raincoat and I had the antenna and I was like sitting like this for hours. And the bird, I think, was doing the same thing. But look at the heart rate. So snowstorm, this is kind of probably a normal elevation daytime to nighttime or activity nighttime to daytime. And then this peak, I want you to look at this number. This is 1,200 beats per minute. That's a hummingbird heart rate. So the normal, crossbills do have high heart rates, being north temperate birds, 500 beats per minute. You can barely hear it with your ear. Like that's really close to the upper limit of human perception, 500 oscillations per minute. They definitely can't hear this. It sounds like a tone, just constant, but it's fluctuating real fast. Okay, so we know that the birds can defend against cold temperatures by investing in the ability to shiver. So they can put a lot of energy and proteins into that ability, or they can spend it somewhere else. And so what you typically see is that birds that are acclimated to warm conditions, like in the summer, have a lower metabolic rate during a cold stress challenge. So you make them cold enough that they really work hard to keep their temperature up. But they're much better at that when they've been in the cold for a while. So they can acclimate. They can build proteins, build shivering capacity, and get better at producing heat. And there's tons of research about this on cold, but there's none on rain. So we were interested in that. So we did a captive experiment where we put birds in warm and dry, warm and rain, cold and dry, or cold and rain conditions for 4 months. They didn't rain for 4 months. It rained for half an hour a day for 4 months. But this was really hard. So 2 grad students who actually just recently graduated helped with this. It was an immense challenge, I will say, trying to rain on birds in a naturalistic way in the lab. So this is a bird in the rain. So we actually ended up, I feel like we captured a very realistic rain. We started with vegetable sprayers, not realistic. It like soaks you instantly, just the spray. So it took a while to kind of dial in a way to do this. We had to build gutter systems that would catch the rain, so we didn't destroy the building. We had silicone running everywhere, Anyway, we had video cameras and activity monitors and all these things. But what we were really interested in was this thermogenic capacity. And so that's what you're looking at here. So the same thing, kind of the ability to produce heat is on the y-axis. And then we did this across November through February. across the winter. So the day length is changing, but they're either in constant cold or constant warm, and then periodic rain or totally dry. And what we see is that the blue ones, these are birds all in cold conditions, they're higher than the red ones. So yes, being in a cold condition, they acclimate, they get better at it, and they produce more heat. But so did rain. So in both the warm and the cold conditions, having rain elevated, it caused them to have to invest more in their heat defense than in the dry conditions. And that is somewhat new. But one of the things that I thought was really fascinating about this outcome is that the temporal pattern was different. So early in the experiment, November to January, this decreasing day length, it's getting colder, right? And typically in the environment. Remember, the temperature isn't changing, but the photoperiod is. So they have cues that, oh, it's getting cold, it's going to get colder, and they invest more. So all 4 groups increased their M-sum just because the days were getting shorter. But then the really interesting thing happened where in this January to February transition, which if you look at the average temperature in Oregon, it bottoms out in January and then February, and it's starting to really pick up into March. So they're turning the corner and going into spring. And what we saw is that the birds in the dry environment started to disinvest. Remember, the temperature is not changing, just day length. But in the rain, they kept it high. So again, they're investing more for longer when it's rainy, which just suggests that there's a cost. They have to invest in this. It's expensive to keep that kind of machinery running. And in fact, this is food intake. So you can see the cold on the left, higher than the warm, but the rain birds are again increasing how much they have to eat in order to meet these costs. Despite it just being, 30 minutes of rain. Even in the warm condition. In fact, the warm birds approached the cold birds' intake levels. So rain's expensive. And now we're really trying to target more storms. In the past, all the heart rate stuff, I actually, even though I had that anecdotal storm event, I tried to avoid storms in general, just for my own self-preservation. But now we're going back in March and we're going to be targeting storms. So we're going to purposely try to get caught in storms. I'm going to skip this story for maybe a next time, but we're interested in the effects of wildfire smoke on birds. And I'm going to end with thank you to many, many people and funders who have contributed to everything that I just showed you. Obviously, super critically important for science to proceed is our teams. And the students do a ton of work, including undergraduates who help us with all aspects, data collection, animal maintenance, and whatnot. So I want to give deep thanks to all of those people on this slide. And I'm going to end by showing you an upcoming, we hope, license plate. So maybe, did you see the shark one? The shark one is I should have put it on here, is my husband's. So he taught me this strategy. This isn't available yet. We're going through the process right now of approvals. And then once it is approved, we will need to sell 3,000 before they will put them into production. So I may be reaching out again in the future. And if you like that, you can donate to science, because almost all the money goes to the nonprofit. If you didn't know that about these vanity plates, a lot of it goes to the nonprofit, and that'll go directly to bird research. So the end.
Fantastic. I want one of those.
Oh, good. I hope you can have one. No. Yeah, no, you don't. Yeah.
Great question. So I think what we'll do is entertain some questions. And the strategy here is I repeat it to the mic so the Zoom audience can get it, and then you'll answer. And I have to somehow paraphrase the question up here, so it gets a little.
Okay, that's fine.
Intro bacon.
Okay.
And then we'll probably have some Zoom questions, Alicia's nodding yes. And then maybe you could sing one more time before you go home?
Yeah, if people want to stay, I'm happy to do that. Yeah.
So, okay, how about it? Questions, John Carter.
In the first part of your talk where the individual bird versus two birds, how physically is the communication taking place? Is it song? Is it movement?
So the question was, and the birds that were paired that were not alike in the first part of your talk, how is that communication taking place that communicates the information that they need?
Yeah, it's a good question that we don't totally know the answer to, but we do have some clues that we think it's both acoustic and visual. So we say acoustic because there are studies that show that when crossbills are foraging together, they do this behavior where they start to all vocalize when they want to leave a tree and go to a different one, as like a vocal crescendo, they say. And so you can kind of predict that the birds are going to go somewhere when you start hearing them start calling to each other, and it kind of elevates and escalates, and then they go. So we think, and we also have seen some effects of when the birds are just in the room, but they can't see each other, but they can hear each other, that we do see a partial effect. But it's strongest when they can see and hear the neighbor. So there's some combination of visual and acoustic cues. And it's not just, I worried that it's just a distressed bird that's like moving around a lot. But with the other species, the fact that it's super specific to who it is makes me think that it's much more fine-tuned than that. It's not just a worried bird.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm intrigued. You see this in both plants and animals, but let's just talk about birds. Is how does the bird know that the day is getting shorter? A lot of the studies you had there, like the last chart you had, was going up and then down.
Yeah.
The bird was sensitive to what month it was. Like I, as a human, I really need a stopwatch to figure this out because it's only a few minutes a day. I'm guessing birds is some kind of protein that's hardwired into their DNA. It can't be learned behavior. It can't be birds talking to each other. It has to be something more in the wiring of the bird. And can you respond to that?
So the question, I think fundamentally is how do the birds register decreasing day length? Do they have some kind of internal clock doing that?
Yeah, so there is a giant field of research about that. And so there are circadian clocks in our bodies in many, many different cells, and those clocks might be different in each of those cells, but there's genes called per and tim, time and period, that do very cool. So they can actually function without photoperiod on an approximate 24-hour cycle, where one of them builds and then shuts off the other one, and then that one builds, or whatever. It's like a oscillating cycle where they're promoting and inhibiting each other, and they do that on a 24-hour approximate cycle. But it'll drift if you don't have a correction from the environment and photoperiodic cues, and that's presumably in most species melatonin. So this is why lights at night can be disruptive to our circadian patterns, because it disrupts the melatonin signal, and our clocks don't have a super accurate timekeeper anymore to the environment. This is also like jet lag, why you feel so crummy, because your clocks are mismatched.
If I can ask a question to hitchhike on that. You're connecting with circadian rhythm, which I understand the 24-hour cycle that we humans experience. Are you suggesting that birds have a 12-month circadian cycle?
Yeah, so circannual cycles, sorry.
Yeah, so there's a suggestion that, it's okay, that birds have a 12-month circadian cycle as opposed to daily.
Yeah, so not in the same way. For that, there are different theories about that. There's calendar theories versus I can't remember all the names for the different theories, but in effect, what we think happens is that there are sensitive periods of the day that is determined by the circadian clock. And if daylight coincides with particular sensitive periods of that day, it gives a signal for season. So for example, after you go through, and the system is only sensitive for particular times of the year. So when a bird goes through the shortest days of the year, it actually kind of resets the system, and it now becomes what's called photosensitive. So now if you took a bird in January and you gave it a pulse of light in the middle of the night, like it was a long June day, that bird would start to develop testes and become reproductive because the signal is telling it that it's summertime. But in a normal situation, it's going to take a long time for the daylight to approach that sensitive period and coincide with, does that make sense? Yeah. So, and there's a ton of nuance about that. But if you put birds in kind of constant, dim 24-hour or like constant 12-12, say 12 hours light, 12 hours dark for years, they'll show a circannual pattern, but it drifts just like circadian patterns would. So it's pretty cool.
So I'm gonna hand the mic off to Alicia. Connie will pick you up, after she reads a few of the Zoom questions. If you wanna do it?
Certainly, first of all, you got a couple of compliments.
Oh, nice.
about
Thank
the
you.
Beautiful slide.
Thank you, Zoomers.
Beautiful license plate. Somebody wants to know if it's possible to share an address, how to get a hold of that.
Oh, well, so what you could do there, so like I said, we're still in the approval process, but you can look up the Little Bird Lab and send me an email, and I keep a list of interested people, so I'm happy to add you to a list.
I hope the audience out there who's listening to this is able to catch that you're gonna write to our speaker and
I also
put your
might
name on a list.
reach out to these various listserv keepers and let people know when it is available. Yeah.
Couple of other questions, really simple one. How long do these birds live, the crossbills?
Yeah, that's a good question. So most songbirds don't live past year one. So high mortality for everything. Eggs, super high. Nestlings, pretty high. Fledglings, pretty high. You know, on you go. And so if you make it through your first year, then you have a pretty good chance of making it for a while. And I'd say that on average for many songbirds, like 5 or 6 years is really normal, and 8 to 10 is an old, like a long-lived bird. I have birds in captivity that are probably older than that because they're in captivity, but they're definitely senescing. It's really interesting, to watch that process in a wild bird. Yeah.
Can I go for one more?
One more.
Okay, one more. It says. Sorry about that. I don't know how you know the answer to this unless you're an archaeologist. It says, did birds migrate less after European settlement?
Oh, okay. So I'm guessing that this question is coming from the perspective of human feeding and provisioning.
Yeah, they wrote easier food source.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I think that humans are influencing migratory patterns for sure. And one of the ways we see that is birds, like the northern limits of birds, will be different if you're in a really rural or natural habitat compared to urban centers. Birds will stay in the north in urban centers at latitudes that they would not stay at if there wasn't human provisioning. So yes, we affect them. Have we like completely changed species level patterns beyond climate change and habitat destruction? I don't know. Yeah, that my guess would be as good as the next person's probably. Yeah.
Connie,
I know there's been a lot of studies with insects and other species of mammals in terms of the reduction of the snowpack. And the ability of snowpack to preserve an ecosphere under there that's habitable and safe. But one of the things I've been thinking about with birds particularly is you see them in the northern or in up in the higher altitudes when there's snow on the trees. That is a tremendous cover, to keep them dry. And so if you have a forest which no longer has the snow covering on all of the trees, and you are just dousing those creatures even more because protection is gone.
Yeah, you're totally right. That,
I
in,
can go. I can't.
okay, I'll do it. The question was about whether or not reduction in snow will also reduce kind of cover for birds to have little microclimates, right? To have places where they can shelter. And I'm sure that that's true. That snow, especially for roosting, can be really important for finding kind of a more thermally protected spot. But well, at the same time that I say that, I will share one observation with Crossbill that blew my mind, which was this really, really cold, windy day. And it was in Jackson Hole, and the bird went to bed on a long, skinny branch with hardly any needles out on the edge. It was getting blown around, and I was like, no way. You are not going to stay there. That's no way. So I stayed extra long. It didn't move, and I came back in the morning before dawn, and it never moved. It was there all night. I think they're just really good at this. But it shocked me. I was like, no way, that's not where you're gonna sleep. And then he did.
I think we need a song.
Okay, you guys wanna hear one more? All right. Okay, well, I'm gonna play one that is about Taylor and I then being shark and bird biologists. The kids named the song the Biology Love Song, so that's what it's named. No, you guys called it that. So it's okay. Meet my 11-year-old. Okay. So anyway, this song is about being a bird, terrestrial mountain bird, ecologist and a shark ecologist. So, and it is called the Biology Love Song, regardless of who named it. Okay. There we go. Gotta get the right tune here. World can be so darn interesting to a young free soul with biology dreams. We tend to spend many months on the road, living and working in nature's abode. Well, this isn't so bad for single ladies roaming the woods, free and easy. But for those of us with our hearts occupied, we battle with love, pain, and desire. When I first met the man I now love so true, I didn't stop to think he's a biologist too. I jumped head first with no hypothesis about loving a man who works on the sea. He is the ocean wide and free. I am the mountains tall and green. Somehow between them, somehow we manage our worlds in between of water and stone, algae and trees. Well, I study birds in a camp where I work. He studies sharks and he bobs like a cork in bright orange light vests and dead mammal goo, while I'm in Carhartt, white with bird poop. It rhymes. Sometimes the work is not too far apart. We can drive to the field and be together by dark. But often I'm several states far away, thinking of him at the end of the day. He is the ocean deep and blue. I am mountain strong and true. Somehow between them we seem to make do. When he wears swim fins, I'll wear snowshoes. That would be great. Well, suppose I can study and I can see darkness, leave the high mountains, not camp in my truck. But I live, breathe for that clean mountain air, like he loves cold salty wind in his hair. He is the ocean and old shanty song, and I am the mountain strong along. And always together our hearts play in tune, like Emmy and Graham, or Johnny and June.
Cornelius. I hope to see y'all back here on November 21st from that same time, 7 o'clock, same place, 221 Allen Hall. Take a look at us on Facebook, share it around. Give us your money. Thanks for coming.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
That's awesome. Listen to you all the time.